Okay, we are back. This is our second interview with my friend Alex Cain, historian, author, historical reenactor, business owner, all kinds of things. Um, One thing I just want to let everybody know, first of all, you should definitely go back and take a look at our first video that we did in the fall. It covers, colonial America leading up just about to the point that we're going to start talking about today, which is the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and what came next. At the end of the video today, stick around and I'm going to show a couple websites and links to Alex's books and his business and whatnot. And I definitely encourage you to check those out. And I think you'll really have a good time and learn something, which is great. So let us get back into this. Um, we finished up last time. We were talking about the problems with the Articles of Confederation
Mhm.
and what was going on in the country leading up to Philadelphia in 1787. But why don't we just sort of go over that a little bit? Why were the articles not working? Why were they failing and leading us to this point?
So the interest that's an excellent question, Andy. And the first thing is when you look at the Articles of Confederation, which were initially drafted in 1777 and ratified by the various states by 1781. What you had was basically, as I said, a confederation. It was the Articles of Confederation were nothing more than a treaty between 13 nations,
Mhm.
those being Massachusetts, New York, South Carolina, and so forth. But they had no teeth. In order, for example, to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed unanimous vote. Um, each state had veto power, similar to what you see with the UN Security Council
Yeah,
today.
let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
The unanimity requirement to amend the articles seems kind of crazy in
Yes,
hindsight to think that 13, I mean, you referred to them as independent nations, and I know they thought of themselves largely in that way.
they did.
When they came up with that provision, didn't anyone raise the issue that, look, if we have a problem here, how are we ever going to get all the states to agree to change it? It just seems like an impossible way to try to change something that's being created by human beings, which are just inherently flawed.
Agreed. It became it was a very tenuous relationship between the states during the American Revolution. You had some states, for example, what became Vermont eventually, up until the end of the American Revolution, was swinging both ways.
Mm,
They were sometimes toying with joining Canada. There were other times they were toying with becoming their own nation away from the United States. So there was also the southern states mistrusted the northern states. The northern states distrusted the central states.
hmm
So the unanimity requirement was sort of a trigger mechanism. It was a rapid decision and a poor decision, but it was in place to prevent states such as Massachusetts bullying Virginia, Virginia bullying New Jersey, or Massachusetts rushing in and creating a war that the rest of the country was then dragged into.
so they sort of came up with a system that everyone could live with,
Yes.
and at the risk of there being problems because they just knew they didn't want there to be any changes because everyone had their own concerns that the changes might make things worse for
Right.
them.
Right, exactly. And
Okay.
so, and keep in mind, these Articles of Confederation existed. They were drafted in 1777 and existed for a decade until 1787. So when the war ended in 1783, you still had a few years
hmm
of the Articles of Confederation dictating what you could say was American policy at that
Yeah.
time.
And again, it kind of goes without saying that these are drafted during the revolution itself.
Yes.
So there's you have a lot of pressing concerns. There are, real reasons to I don't know how much confidence there was that they were going to succeed in the revolution in the first place. It was such a daunting challenge. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm sure to some extent it was, look, we just got to kind of come up with something that will unite us in some fashion.
Yep.
And obviously during the war, I know Washington had a great trouble getting the states to pay and to provide soldiers and for soldiers to stick around. It was just, again, it really was so miraculous that they were able to hold together long enough.
It really was a miraculous accomplishment if you think about it. And there were several times where revolution could have simply collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
Politically, it could have collapsed. There were times when there were multiple mutinies. Line, the Pennsylvania line, the New Jersey lines were always mutinying. There was even a talk in 1781 or 1782 of a military coup where they
Mm-hmm.
would basically oust Congress and replace it with the military. So it was
Yeah.
a very tenuous situation. And it's interesting you mentioned about debts, because that was the big problem coming out of the American Revolution, was all the states and these United States were in debt to Europe,
Mm-hmm.
France, Denmark, Spain. And at one point, there was a discussion of imposing tariffs to pay for or pay down the debt.
Mm-hmm.
Rhode Island vetoed it or objected to it.
Yeah.
And then you have this unanimity requirement, because the Articles of Confederation required for a tariff to be imposed, all 13 states had to jump on board.
Yeah. Was that Robert Morris's
Yes.
effort or plan to, he was a leading financier in the country at that point in time. And, I've just been reading Plain Honest Men,
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
leading up to, in going through the
Hmm.
Constitutional Convention. And, it was talking about just how impossible after the war. I mean, he was given powers that people were uncomfortable giving him, because it was just, they had to do anything they could to try to get income coming into the
Yes.
country so that debts
Yes.
could be paid. Because, like you said, with Spain and France and Denmark, these were established countries who expected their loans to be repaid.
Oh,
And if
yes.
this country had any hopes of remaining and becoming an actual country, in the world, a legitimate full-fledged country, it could not default on these loans.
Exactly, exactly. And it became a situation that very quickly the United States was developing a reputation of being a deadbeat,
Yeah.
because particularly with their allies. Spain and France were very upset in the years after the war that, like, we financed the war, we supported your Continental Army, we supported your Continental Navy, and here you are, you guys can't even get your act together.
Now, where were Spain and France on the continent at this point? How was France still in Canada? Did they still have a footprint there? And was Spain still, down south in Florida and whatnot?
It was constantly evolving, is the best way I could describe it. France had lost Canada at the end of the French and Indian War, so they had basically been expelled
Mm-hmm.
from the Canadian provinces. They still had held territories down in the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
and they did have some colonies as well in Africa, in Asia. So they were still active. From France's perspective, the American Revolution was very expensive,
Mm-hmm.
and the king put France further and further in debt. Now, Spain was France's number one ally. It would be the equivalent of what we are with England right now.
Mm-hmm.
So when France jumped into the war to support America, Spain came along with them. Spain, land-wise, did a little bit better initially. They got Florida back, which
Mm-hmm.
they had lost during the French and Indian War, but then they quickly turned around and sold it back to England.
Yeah.
So there were many loyalists who had fled the southern colonies to Florida, thinking they would be under the protection of England, and then suddenly Spain is taking over their colony.
Yeah.
Spain and France sort of went back and forth with the Louisiana Territory. Ultimately, it ended up in France's hand, so that you had United States eventually purchasing from
Mm-hmm.
France the Louisiana Territory. But the interesting thing is, at the end of the American Revolution in 1783, it's Spain that's controlling the Louisiana Territory, and they're controlling the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as the early American nation is trying to expand westward and train or trade, excuse me, on the Mississippi, Spain is busting their hump
Mm-hmm.
and not really giving them access to the Mississippi. And of course, because of the Articles of Confederation, who deals with Spain?
Yeah.
It's this loose confederation, and all they really had was a unicameral Congress, which really wasn't sure how to address international diplomacy.
Yeah, and that unicameral, legislative body, as we've discussed in my class, every state had an equal vote. Each state
Yes,
had one vote. So
yes,
when you have sort of a problematic little state like Rhode Island, really thwarting the will of the rest of the country and the larger, more powerful states. That's a problem, as we
Yes.
saw. So,
Yes.
um, so we have obviously we have these financial problems that we've talked about. There are some, problems with foreign powers that
Mhm.
are brewing and that are very
Yep.
important. Um, in addition, we have more domestic problems where we
Yes.
have former soldiers who I think are still owed quite a lot of money from their service as well that are not being paid. And
Hmm.
they themselves have their own personal debts as well that have
Yes.
sort of built up while they've been fighting. And then we have the states themselves who have their own debts to build on that. So, now um, we know about Shays Rebellion
Hmm.
and the problems that presented. And, you have a farmers' rebellion out in Western Mass. It's a debtor crisis where they're
Yep.
blocking the courthouse doors to try to keep from being thrown off their land. Um, and Massachusetts was ill-equipped to deal with it. The Massachusetts government was just not powerful enough, and there was no federal authority available to help out.
Correct.
So yeah.
No, go ahead. By means.
Well, so ultimately, my understanding is the governor of Massachusetts had to hire his own private army, and
Yes.
eventually the rebellion was put down, but word got down to spread across the country, and one of the people who heard about it was George Washington down in
Hmm.
Virginia and was quite concerned about this. Although I did read that he was getting some exaggerated reports from Henry Knox and some other people about how bad the rebellion was, and there seems to be some misinformation being conveyed as well.
Fake news.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was one of the big problems with the 18th century and 19th century presses. We won't get into modern day press,
Yeah.
where there were often stories were grossly exaggerated,
Mhm.
or um, even made up just to sensationalize and sell papers. Shays Rebellion was a culmination of an entire hot mess, is the best way I could describe it. You had, as you perfectly described it, you had soldiers who were owed money, farmers and poorer individuals within wealthy too were deeply in debt. You had high inflation. When the nation was created, they, basically in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a nation's currency was dependent upon their gold or silver reserves. And there was this transition over to paper money by the United States where there was nothing to really back it up. So as a result, inflation kicked in. The states were just simply printing money.
Mhm.
You had trade wars that were going on between states. Massachusetts engaged in a trade war with New Hampshire and Rhode Island. Rhode Island retaliated because it seems like Rhode Island is our problem little
Yeah.
nation at this point.
Yes.
Retaliated by opening up Newport and making it a free port with free trade.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yes, so you
Yeah.
had all these problems culminating, which resulted in Shays Rebellion, as you perfectly described. The governor did have to hire out almost a private contracted army to put this rebellion down.
Yeah.
And it wasn't something that only took a day or two, it took months to put this rebellion down.
Yeah.
Shays was forced to flee into hiding. Um, and the other thing, which before I go on, I should also mention is because of the high inflation rate, there were also an increase in food prices. The
Mhm.
states were trying to impose their own internal taxes, not federal taxes, but internal
Yeah.
taxes. Many people were actually questioning, did we do the right thing in rebellion against England? And there was an author. And she wrote a book on, it's called Liberty's Exiles. And I'm
Mhm.
drawing a blank on her name right now. And I think you and I talked about it previously. There were Americans who were scooting across the Canadian border, renouncing their citizenship because of all
Yeah.
the mess that was going on down in the United States. So when you have all that, the word got back down to various officials in the Confederation, and they realized that the powder keg was about to explode. That
Yeah.
Shays' rebellion was just uh, a culmination of all the problems, and as a result, there was a meeting. And
Mhm.
it was referred to as the Annapolis Convention or the Annapolis meeting, where you had about 10 to 12 of the states present, and they basically said, what do we do? There's clearly some problems with the Articles of Confederation. We have to do something.
Now,
And
who
so
were some of the figures who were present that we would be aware of?
Elbridge Gerry
Mhm.
was one of them from Massachusetts.
And
Benjamin,
gerrymandering infamy.
same exact person.
Yeah.
Benjamin Franklin, as well as Alexander Hamilton, were two others.
Was Madison there?
I don't think
I
Madison was. I know. I'm cheating. I'm looking at my notes here as I
No,
look at.
that's good. And who was there from Virginia? If I'm
We had Virginia was Edmund Randolph. James Madison was there. I was wrong.
okay.
And St. George Tucker. You had Franklin and Tench Coates from Pennsylvania. It was spearheaded by New Jersey. Abraham Clark and William Houston were the two that pushed it, as did Hamilton from New York.
Yeah, was it there were concerns about waterway disputes and there were trade
That's
issues were one of the central things that particular meeting had to do with, if I'm not mistaken.
that is exactly it. It was basically, rather than look at, they wanted to address the issues they had
Yeah.
but it more focused on trade and more
Yeah.
focused on internal issues. How can we resolve this and sort of smooth things over? But it led to a recommendation that there be a second meeting, which in turn led to what was called the Philadelphia Convention, or the Grand Convention of Philadelphia. It wasn't until the 19th century that the meeting eventually became known as the Constitutional Convention.
So let's talk about Annapolis for a minute. So
Yeah.
we have these leading figures
Hmm.
in the country who are there to try to work, with the Articles of Confederation to try
Yes.
to resolve some issues that the country is facing. And I don't even think they were successful in terms of addressing those particular issues. I don't know if they were insufficient people there or whatnot. Um, they recognized the problems of the articles.
Hmm.
Um, and is it fair to say that they began to sort of scheme a little bit to, we need to do something more significant than this, because these changes are they're just going to lead to a terrible result. Um, but they weren't allowed to do anything like that at this point because the articles were supposed to exist in perpetuity. And as we talked about before, could only be changed with the unanimous vote of all 13 states, which wasn't happening.
Right.
So what did they do? How did they come up with their strategy for the next step in what we ultimately now know as that 1787 convention in Philadelphia? How did they get from Annapolis to Philadelphia?
Well, you hit the nail right on the head. The problem was they weren't able to resolve much at the Annapolis Convention, and they realized because you didn't have all the states there, they needed to have some form of a more meaningful meeting or convention to discuss how do we repair the Articles of Confederation. The belief going into the Annapolis Convention was there's a wound on the Articles of Confederation. How do we treat that wound?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't simply just let the body die and let's
Yeah.
bring in the new baby. So it was one where they went in initially for Annapolis. It was how do we repair some of these issues and move forward. So I think initially from their mindset, most of them, I'm going to talk in a second about two individuals who had different plans.
Mm-hmm.
But from their mindset, it was how do we fix what we have and then move forward with what we have. The issue what became was James Madison from Virginia and Alexander Hamilton from New York. They wanted to see more. And James Madison, interesting enough, had studied democracies throughout history, and there weren't many to study. He looked at Greek democracy. He looked at the Roman Empire. There was a big fascination in the 18th and early 19th century with the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, he looked at the political structures of the Roman Empire, pre-empire and during the empire. And then he also looked at Switzerland and Denmark, who were traditionally monarchies, but they were more of a constitutional democracy than perhaps England was at the time. And so he looked at those as well. And so he and Hamilton, although they didn't correspond, because Hamilton was looking at his own ideas as well. How can we, take the Confederation and toss it out the window? But they were starting to, draft internally a map or outline. How do we repair this? And Madison came to the conclusion that the uh, uh, articles should simply be scrapped.
Mhm.
Now, the thing was, after the Annapolis delegation or the Annapolis convention finished, there was a general consensus. We need to meet again. We weren't able to achieve much here. We were only focusing predominantly on trade. There's still these issues of inflation. There's a growing stratification of society. We don't know how we can address military or foreign issues. There isn't even an issue of paying down our debts as a nation. We need to meet again. And all of the states but one, Rhode Island. By the time we're done, we're going to be convinced that we should send Rhode Island out to sea.
Yeah, that might not be the worst idea.
Yeah. With the remaining 12 out of the 13 at this time, they all agreed that they should meet. Now, when the various state legislatures sent their representatives to the Constitutional Convention, the state legislatures, which were really the governing authorities of the various state nations at the time, most of them were under the impression we're just going to be tweaking the Articles of Confederation to deal with issues of debt, to deal with issues of trade, to deal with foreign diplomacy. That's it. A lot of them did not see coming initially where Madison was going or what his dream was.
So, what was the legislative body under the Articles? Was that a Confederation Congress? Is that how they referred to that body?
Yes. So you had a unicameral Congress, and it was usually each state would send at least one delegate to the Confederation Congress. Each state only had one vote, however.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, it's just the rules of voting procedures varied from state to state.
Yeah, my understanding was that it was sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know if apathetic is the right description, but the body wasn't an especially vigorous body that was active and doing many things. So when the folks from Annapolis requested this second meeting with more participation, it even took some time to get a response. And ultimately, as I understand it, the Confederation Congress was very specific in what they charged these delegates with doing in Pennsylvania, and they explicitly, well, maybe their language is a little vague, but they made an effort to make clear that they were there to that the amending of the articles was the only thing that could potentially even be contemplated. And I think it had to ultimately come back, and anything they had done was supposed to be approved by the Confederation Congress and also approved by the various state legislatures as well. So they made some effort to keep them from doing what they ultimately did, although of course it was ineffective or insufficient.
Yeah, the best way you could describe, I mean, if you look back in history, what major pieces of legislation or what major acts did the Confederation Congress do? I can't think of any. And, even during the Constitutional Convention, the debate on the executive branch, there was an argument we should model the executive branch after what was believed to be the executive branch of the Confederation, which was nothing more than a committee of delegates who would deal with foreign diplomacy. And it came out during the debate that they hadn't met for months and months and months. So it just shows the weakness of the Confederation. I mean, a perfect example just to show you how when it came to foreign trade and debt collection, between the end of the American Revolution and about 1790, post passage of the U.S. Constitution, it was the states that were collecting any trade tariffs that were coming in. So if you went to Newburyport, which I know is down the road from you and I, it was the state of Massachusetts that was collecting any imports coming in, and none of it was going to these United States. So it became a problem, and that's what Madison and Hamilton and others recognized when they decided we're going to have this meeting in Independence Hall, and we're going to try and basically lob a grenade in the room and shake things up.
So the Confederation Congress is not fully aware of what Madison and Hamilton are thinking of, but they try to still make clear, listen, we'll approve this idea, but it's still is under our auspices and is limited in what you even can consider doing.
Mhm.
So the convention is set for, I guess, May of 1787. That was
Yep.
when it was set to begin in Philadelphia. And going into this meeting, what who was doing what at this point in time? Who was really sort of plotting out a strategy to take with them there? What was happening? What was in the works? And what were the concerns or the challenges that they were facing?
Well, the first thing you had, which was an obvious one, was operations and procedure.
Mm,
First getting everybody there. This is May. However, when you get to the Massachusetts states, the New Hampshire, Maine province, and New York, you've got mud season. So trying
mhm,
to even get people to travel down to Philadelphia was difficult on its own. But the major players, you had Madison, you had Hamilton. You had Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania. And then you also had, of course, the obvious choice, who they elected unanimously for president of the convention, was George Washington.
mhm,
So going into this, everyone did see the seriousness of the meeting. Everyone had received their instructions. So every delegate who was leaving, whether they were leaving from Massachusetts or whether they were leaving from Georgia, had received instructions from their legislature as to how often they were supposed to be in communication,
mhm.
what would happen, during this thing. Were they required to be present during votes? If 3 delegates were sent, did 3 able to vote in uh, separately, or did they have to provide a unanimous vote? What would happen if the delegates were split on
Yeah.
a vote? So each of the states had these procedures coming in. Meanwhile, Madison is already drafting a blueprint, and he's not the only one. You did have an individual from New Jersey, I think his name was Stickney, who was basically trying to create his own blueprint about how we fix things. So you had basically ultimately 3 plans that came into play as everyone. You had Madison, who's drafting what became known as the Virginia Plan or the Virginia Blueprint. There's another delegate who was basically drafting the New Jersey Plan or the New Jersey Blueprint. Then there was a little known South Carolina plan that pretty much was a ripoff of James Madison's plan, so it got absorbed into it.
Yeah.
But you had going in, people were thinking as they're working their way down to Philadelphia, they're serious about their job, and they are serious about how they can try and fix this. With the New Jersey plan, pretty much what it was looking at was trying to fix it within the confines of the Articles of Confederation. He made some various recommendations. It was William Patterson, and Stickney was the individual from the Carolinas who had his plan. So Patterson's plan, as he's heading down to Pennsylvania, he's coming up with the idea of basically creating a Congress, just a Congress that's based upon Parliament, and that it
Mhm.
would operate within the confines of the Articles of Confederation. And he had actually suggested stripping away some of the restrictions, for example, the unanimity requirement.
So this is Patterson, or this
This
is
is Patterson.
okay.
So Stickney's plan from Carolina basically modeled after Madison's. He had made a recommendation for, I believe, 2 branches of government as opposed to 3. And he had also made a recommendation for a bicameral legislature
Yeah.
as well. But it was Patterson's that was he was the first step, where he had his New Jersey plan. Where he's like, let's try and completely revamp this Articles, but keep the Articles. He
Mm,
had hoped to try and strengthen the Confederation Congress by creating it the model after Parliament. So there was a upper house and a lower house. He did not really propose an executive branch, and there was nothing discussing about the judiciary. But he did have various reforms he had talked about, doing away with the unanimity requirement, giving the Confederation power to impose tariffs, give them greater power to raise troops
mhm.
and engage in foreign debates. But it was Madison that had his plan. And as soon as the delegates were starting to arrive, he already started lobbying them. And of course, he has to look at, who are the most powerful states at the time. Well, Virginia is one of them.
Hmm.
You also had Pennsylvania and you had Massachusetts and New York. Those are the big four.
Hmm.
Hamilton seemed to ascribe to Madison's theory. He had some concerns relative towards the executive branch and how that power should be. But he seemed to ascribe to Madison's view. Massachusetts at first was surprisingly a little reluctant towards the idea. Massachusetts, up through the War of 1812, actually treated itself more as an independent nation
Mm.
than part of, and
Even
merely
that late,
even
that
that late.
far into the development of the country.
Yep. So Massachusetts actually led a movement during the War of 1812 to secede
Hmm.
from the nation. It didn't succeed, but when people talk about secession, they always look at the South first. It was
Yeah,
actually Massachusetts that
I
did
didn't know
it
about
first.
that.
Yeah. And so Massachusetts was brought in a little bit kicking and screaming. New Hampshire and Connecticut. Connecticut was very supportive of the proposition of both plans. And of course, we'll discuss the Connecticut Compromise in a
Yeah.
little bit. But you had, going into this, there was clearly at least three schools of thought. How do we do it? Do we fix it within the Articles of Confederation? Do we scrap it? Or do we find some happy middle?
Yeah.
Ultimately, they scrap it. So these people came, and of course, delegates were coming and going all the time. It wasn't they couldn't have everybody there at the same time. New Hampshire didn't even arrive until halfway through
Yeah.
the convention. Go New Hampshire. Rhode Island, as we said, the redheaded stepchild never showed.
Yeah. Now let me just stop for 1 second.
Yeah.
So when we've talked about some of the different plans,
Hmm.
and a good shorthand to sort of talk about the interests or the objectives of the plans. You have the Virginia plan, which is really a plan that's favoring those larger, most important states.
Yes.
And Madison, coming from Virginia, has a focus on, or a belief that his state,
Hmm.
which is already a very established, very important, significant state, should have a commensurate authority in
Hmm.
this new country, as opposed to a little state like a Rhode Island. And
Yes.
Patterson's New Jersey plan is really the counter to that. It's a plan that's really focused on the interests of the smaller states. Just as a
Correct.
quick shorthand, so
Yes.
we've the initial um, sort of rivalry to be dealt with is a large state, small state rivalry at the beginning. There are many other issues to come. My understanding is that Virginia plan came within one vote of actually being adopted pretty early on in the convention.
Yes.
And I think it was a large state delegate who ultimately said, no, no, no. And sort of caused that to go back to the drawing board. Is that
That is
your
correct.
understanding?
My memory is it's either a New York or a Pennsylvania delegate. I want to say it was a Pennsylvania
I
delegate.
think so too.
Yeah, kind of backed off from it. And you have to keep in mind, Madison's plan was for a strong centralized government.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, under this plan, if everything just went the way Madison wanted it, who's going to be driving the strong centralized government? But the powerful big states. The New Jersey plan was, benefit of the Articles of Confederation. The one thing I guess I will concede about the Articles of Confederation is it did protect the smaller states.
Mm-hmm.
The perfect example again is that tariff issue that Rhode Island, the smallest state in the country, was able to kill with just one vote. So that was the benefit, and what a lot of the smaller states were nervous about. New Hampshire, Maryland, New Jersey were less populous,
Mm-hmm.
and they had less a smaller economy, and they were very, very reluctant to see larger states trample over them. And this essentially becomes what is going to go on even up until today. How powerful should the central government be,
Mm-hmm.
and what is considered states' rights? What is the rights of that individual small state to protect itself and protect its internal interests? And
Yeah.
that's the competing debate going on during this convention during that time. The sole movement. I mean, you start to see some block issues as you're going along. Particularly the issue of slavery and when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to trade. But when it comes to state rights are predominantly driving the dispute in this
Yeah.
convention.
Well, that's an important point too, because there are different, I don't know if factions is the right word to use in this context, but it's not all the large states don't agree on everything with one another. All the small
Hmm.
states don't agree with one another on everything. You have some large states that are northern states that are anti-slave states. You
Yes.
have some who are slave states. So, um, yet they still had certain things and certain interests in common in terms of representation and
Hmm.
the basic structure of the. I think there was pretty it didn't take long, I don't think, for people to agree to the rough outline of three branches of an executive, a
Yes.
judicial, and a legislative branch. But that, the bicameral legislature, the original Virginia plan, I guess, had a plan for a bicameral legislature, but um, it was based upon the population of the state. So this was going to be a bad outcome for those small states that were never going to compete on population.
Hmm.
Um, but ultimately, you know, there were the Virginia plan was sort of thwarted, um, and went back to the drawing board. Virginia plan comes out, and now we have a pretty good debate going on. Now, um, at this point in time, I think there are probably how many delegates were down there? To about 50 had
Roughly
ultimately arrived.
yeah, about 50 to 55 were there throughout the convention.
And obviously not even all of them were participating. You maybe had sort of in the 30s, maybe high
Yes.
30s, who were actively participating. Um, at this point in time, the Confederation Congress is still functioning and
Yep.
meeting in New York, as this is happening as well. So when contentious issues were happening, I think one of the things that they one of the rules that they agreed to was that the proceedings would be secret.
Hmm.
The blinds would be drawn. No one was to say anything outside of that room about what had been discussed. And I think one of the reasons was that they wanted people to feel free to change their minds as
Yes.
the debate went on, as new ideas were hashed out and criticized. And they wanted this to be a legitimate, this was serious stuff. And they wanted real thinking and debating to be happening. And when the larger body wasn't able to come to agreements, um, how did they deal with those issues when there were large issues that all the delegates couldn't agree upon? Did they come up with an approach to sort of deal with those issues?
There was two approaches. It's the first one. Some of the resolutions would be, or how they when they hit an impasse, sometimes they would form committees,
Mm-hmm.
and the committees would actually get together and try and hammer out some compromise, and then they would present it to the entire delegation present, and they would try and resolve it that way. Um, but often, what happens is a lot of politicking behind the scenes.
Yeah.
You would have various people negotiating with various parties. The perfect example, goes to what's referred to as the Connecticut Compromise, where there was a debate, as you and I are talking about. How if you go with a bicameral legislation, how do you protect the small states, but at the same time allow the larger states to exert their influence? And when they created it, everyone agreed finally we were going to create this bicameral legislature. The smaller states wanted representation, a fixed number of representation per state, so to balance it out. The larger states obviously wanted, by per population. And so it was Connecticut Compromise was basically we had the Connecticut delegation went both through committee as well as negotiating through both parties to come up with this proposal. Why not both? Why don't we have
Mm-hmm.
one of what would basically be considered the upper house, the Senate, be basically so many representatives per state. Whether you're small or large, you're going to have an equal number, but at the same time, you can have this smaller. I mean, you can have the lower house, Congress, or House of Representatives, be based upon your state's population. And that's what it was an example, how you were able to get through these impasses.
Yeah.
Another example dealt with slavery.
Mm-hmm.
When we walked into the Constitutional Convention, the only states that were considered banished or outlawed slavery were the New England states and Pennsylvania. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
New Jersey, New York, Maryland, they all had slavery. So, but it was the South that was fiercely wanted to retain this institution because their economy was very dependent upon it. So you had these great debates and going on back and forth. Where on the one hand, the northern states wanted to put in the Constitution to ban slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Southern states were threatening that's the deal breaker for us. We will walk away. So what they did is one of the agreements was, in exchange for getting the southern states to support the Three-Fifths Compromise, they kicked or punted whether or not to abolish the slave trade until 1808.
Hmm.
So they kicked it, out a couple of
Yeah.
decades
Yeah, exactly.
to deal with it. And it was, again, those backroom dealings that even today you see with politicians. You'd like to think they're engaged in compromise. Other areas came, compromise on the definition of the executive branch.
Hmm.
Some people wanted the executive branch to be run by committee.
Hmm.
I think one legislature, perhaps being somewhat sarcastic, had proposed a hereditary, creation.
Yeah, that's
Um,
great. That
but yeah,
that was a
that went
great
over
idea.
well.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they were able to compromise and realize that the executive should be a single individual. And
Yeah.
again, it goes through the negotiation that's going on. So you had a combination of both when they would hit impasses. But a perfect example of when impasses they don't have results, they simply moved on. And a perfect example was there was discussion of the bill, what became the Bill of Rights. Do
Yeah.
we incorporate in the Constitution the various Bill of Rights, press rights, right to bear arms, free from search and seizure, etc. Those were all tabled.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they were debated and discussed at the Constitutional Convention. Many of the delegates thought, well, it's implied or it's believed that these rights are going to be contained in this Constitution. We don't need to address it. Others wanted to address it, and it kind of, they couldn't get
Yeah.
a sense, so they just moved on. And you saw
Yeah.
that from time to time as well.
Yeah. And that, that of course is going to become a big issue when it comes time to debate ratification around the country.
Yes.
But at that point in time, many of the state constitutions had their own Bill of Rights.
Hmm.
Um, the I don't think the rights themselves were necessarily objectionable, but the idea of those, or the thinking of those who didn't think it was necessary to include it in the Constitution itself, was that this was a document of limited powers to this new national government. And
Yes.
the idea, the thinking was that if it's not written down, if it's not included, they don't have it, so we don't have anything to worry about. Now, in hindsight, that seems very naive, because we
Right.
know just the natural, ambition of these individuals and these branches ultimately is going to constantly be seeking to acquire more power and more
Hmm.
authority. So I think what you hit on a good point, which is we do have this is ultimately a compromise document, of course, because we have all these different delegates, these different states with diverse interests and
Hmm.
concerns and goals. They all shared the goal of a country that could continue, that could survive,
Hmm.
past these rocky times. But um, beyond that, there was negotiating, there was politicking that could happen, to sort of come up with imperfect but acceptable solutions. But there were certain issues that were going to be deal breakers, and specifically slavery.
Yes.
I think it fair to say that the delegates all understood that this was something that the South could not abide. If the Constitution made an attempt to end slavery, at least South Carolina, a very powerful
Yep.
delegation at that point in time, they made clear they weren't bluffing. They were leaving, and it just was going to collapse if that had happened.
That is correct. From the southern states, you know, Virginia and South Carolina are probably the two most powerful of the Southern delegations. South Carolina had, of course, Charleston, which was a major seaport at the
Mm,
time, and a lot of business coming through. They were very vocal that the institution of slavery had to be preserved from their perspective. And they did, as the compromise was going along, they made several concessions to ensure um, that the institution would continue because it was a deal breaker. And it varied. Again, from their perspective, they felt that slavery, if it was abolished, would cripple their economy.
mhm,
There was also an issue of race relations as well, that if suddenly you have multiple slaves freed, they were afraid of possible insurrections
mhm,
or retaliation, and as well as threat to their livelihoods. So the South went in with a unified approach that slavery was a deal breaker. So one of the ways that the South used their position, saying, "Listen, it was almost, it became of you need us, we don't need you
Yeah.
approach. When it came to determining, how do you determine the populations of states for purposes of the legislature? They demanded that the slave population be counted as part of it. Of course, they wanted one-for-one voting. The North did not want any of the slaves counted because at the time around the Constitutional Convention, if you excluded and did not count any of the enslaved people, the population of the South obviously would drop dramatically, which means their representation in the legislature would go down significantly. So they eventually was proposed the three-fifths compromise. And with the three-fifths compromise, it was each slave or the total slave population would count as three-fifths of a person. So you then do the mathematical formula and it comes out with the population. But the South demanded a few more concessions beyond that. They weren't just simply happy with three-fifths. They wanted to, as they successfully did, they kicked back the international slave trade issue until about 12 years later was the earliest it was going to be addressed. And on top of that, they demanded a Fugitive Slave Act be included as well, which is one of the big things. So by now, you have New England and Pennsylvania, which have outright outlawed slavery. Pennsylvania was the first, Massachusetts was the second. And so what happened is these slaves are now fleeing to the north. And of course, also, there is the issue of they could keep going from the north into Canada or into Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia was actually a big haven for both Black loyalists and escaped slaves.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So as a result, the South saw New England particularly as this funnel of their property being stolen and going up to Canada to live. So this is why they demanded the Fugitive Slave Act. Once you had those two trigger mechanisms in place, particularly that the issue of the international trade of slave trade was kicked back, and it ultimately wasn't banned until 1808. And so it was kicked back. And of course, I think the South recognized that. They took the gamble saying, not much gets done in legislatures anyway. So they're really going to deal with this 12 years from now, or is it going to be, they actually bought themselves an extra decade. But by then the abolitionist movement had started to churn up. It was starting to move. So the South definitely, and of course you did have some sympathizers with the South as well. You had New York did have a sizable slave population, so they were somewhat sympathetic to the South. New Jersey kind of played it both ways. On the one hand, they had New York to their northwest, so they were sympathetic, but to the south was Pennsylvania, which had abolished slavery. So they kind of played it close, but it was New England was very, very hard pushing for outright banishment in the Constitution.
So as like a counterfactual, had the free states pushed to ban slavery in the Constitution, what do you think? I mean, aside from the southern states leaving and there not being a new Constitution, what do you think would have happened at that point in time? What would have been sort of the sequence of events, as much as you can guess, as best as you can guess?
I'm always a big fan of alternate history.
So
I think the South would have walked away at that point. I think the North and the mid-Atlantic states would have tried to continue to press on ahead without them. You would have had one of three possible scenarios. Scenario number one is nothing gets done. They say we failed, we tried, and the Articles of Confederation continue to go forward. I think what you would have seen from there is you would have seen basically probably all these smaller states, well, actually you probably would have seen the Articles of Confederation start to basically break apart. And you probably would have seen regional alliances start to be formed. New England, perhaps with New York, although I don't think so. You probably would have seen New England be in one region, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey be in another regional country, and then probably the Southern delegation.
Do you think the European powers would have, come back in and tried to absorb maybe or affiliate themselves with some of these regions?
England was already doing that. England was really had its finger in the mess that was Vermont. Vermont at the end of the American Revolution declared its independence from everybody. They were sort of like Texas. They said, we're our own country.
Leave me alone.
Yes, but they aligned with the United States. Now, by the time of the Constitutional Convention, they had yet to become a state. They were sort of this quasi-independent territory. They said, we're no longer part of New Hampshire, we're no longer part of New York, we're our own little area.
Yeah.
England was actively going down and trying to negotiate for Vermont to join the Canadian Union
Yeah.
and become a Canadian territory, which pretty much would have put a split almost into, between New York and New England.
Hmm.
And they were advocating up until about the Constitutional Convention for this to happen. And it didn't happen. England, on top of that, was often negotiating more. They disliked. They weren't fans of New England. New England
Yeah.
was an economic competitor, So,
Yeah.
but they were trying to negotiate with New York, and they were trying to negotiate with Pennsylvania to engage in trading relations.
Yeah.
You had Spain, which basically was engaged in a trade war with these United States, as I call them,
Yeah.
during this period of time, particularly on the Mississippi. So they would have probably stuck if the states sort of continued as a confederation. I think Spain would have probably pressed the western frontier a little bit more.
Yeah.
You then get into, let's assume that the convention failed. You then get into France and what happens in 1789 with the French Revolution. And we'll
Yeah.
assume, just for argument's sake, the French Revolution continues forward. You wouldn't have had, I think at that point, the US probably would have been even in a worse economic position because you have both France and English navies intercepting trade. And
Yeah.
so as a result, the New England economy was hit a little bit hard by that. I think you would have seen probably even further collapse of if the Confederation still existed at that
Yeah.
point. Ultimately, I think what would have happened if the convention failed, I think you probably, you could have seen all 13 states just dissolve at that point, become 13 independent nations. I still think it would have went into regional alliances eventually. Or you could have perhaps seen, the only other scenario I can think of is two independent nations, what eventually you saw in the Civil War, a North and a South.
Yeah.
But my prediction of the three would have been the Articles would have continued for a little bit further, but ultimately you would have seen it replaced with regional confederations.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. So they work through these issues. Let me just backtrack for 1 second because one thing I don't think we mentioned, we kind of talked about, but not specifically to. Who has something to lose if the Articles of Confederation are replaced? And ultimately, it's the states. The states have this. They, as you discussed before, this is a loose pact between states. States think of themselves to some extent as independent nations. And they fought very hard for this status just a short time before when they declared their independence from Great Britain. And politicians are politicians, people are people, and human nature is what it is. And if the Confederation is going to be replaced by a new national government, then that national government is going to be absorbing power that had previously been possessed by someone or something else.
Exactly.
And that's the concern that these folks have, because the states are going to be reluctant to give up, or certainly the state legislatures are going to be reluctant to give up the power that they currently possess, even though things aren't going great in many ways.
That's exactly, you hit it right again, right on the nail on the head, Andy. Here's the thing. From the individual perspective, Alex Cain and Andy Goldstein are, living in, Bradford, and what my area would have been Amesbury at the time, and we're just farmers. Really, most of our concern is going to be local politics. Okay, maybe some issues with the state legislature. That's where it begins and ends. We're really not going to have much of a view on federal politics. It's the state legislatures that actually have the biggest concern. In 1787, the most powerful political bodies in these United States is the legislatures.
Yeah.
And they're looking at losing a tremendous amount of power. I mean, if you go back to, again, when I talked about Newburyport with the maritime trade, Newburyport had a custom house, as we all know. From 1783 up until 1790, or 1789, actually, it was run by the state of Massachusetts. With this new proposed central government, that now becomes federal property, and Massachusetts loses that source of revenue. When it comes to disputes between the federal government and Virginia, the federal government's going to win under the view of supremacy clause. So it becomes the biggest losers economically and politically, and even militarily is going to be the states. The states did retain, I would say, when you look at now 2021 versus 1799 after the federal government, the states still had some more power. I mean, that they had national, they had militia companies, they still engaged some authority, but over time it becomes more and more of a centralized government, and the states eventually start to lose their power.
Yeah, and we talk about that in my class when we talk about federalism and how that's evolved over time. So we've got the large state plan, the Virginia plan, we have the small state plan, the New Jersey plan, we ultimately have the Connecticut Compromise, which, as you described before, resolves the issue of representation to a point where people can live with it, where we have a bicameral legislature, we have the upper house, which is the Senate, where each state has equal representation. We have the lower house, the House of Representatives, which is based upon population. So from there, they ultimately, create their Supreme Court. They have this national judiciary. It's pretty limited, but they grant Congress the authority to expand it as necessary and make it what it ultimately becomes. And then there's, as you said, there's discussion about what form this executive is going to take. Ultimately, they agree on a single energetic executive. This is, I know, is a big Hamilton, he's very focused on the need for that energetic executive. And, a lot of these folks who suffered through the revolution and tried to fight it, realized realized the need for an energetic and powerful executive, because they had lived with a dilly-dallying legislative body that just was not up to providing what was needed to fight that war, when it had occurred. So ultimately they come up with an agreed upon document, what we now know as the United States Constitution. But among the delegates, did every delegate end up signing off on this Constitution that was ultimately agreed upon?
Again, we exclude Rhode Island because they pulled a no-show. There were some delegates that refused. I mean, the first thing you have to keep in mind, of the 55 delegates you had there, almost half of them were combat veterans from the American Revolution. So they had that aspect in the back of their mind. The other half had predominantly served in the Continental Congress. So they had, Congress, the Continental Congress, we romanticized the Continental Congress. It was a very inefficient body. The Articles of the Confederation was born from the Continental Congress. It was just ineptitude being carried over to a new administration. So they had that in mind as well. But there were some delegates who absolutely refused to sign off on the document. Of course, there was some who were not present. There were others who just, felt that it was, they just were opposed to it. But
George Mason was a significant Virginian who did not support. I mean, he was a delegate and he did not support the Constitution.
He didn't. It ultimately, of the 50 to 55, it was roughly about 4/5, or about 38 or 39 ended up signing it. And there were some individuals like Mason is a perfect example. There was with part of his motivation was his own politics, that he was planning on going back to his state and to start campaigning. Hey, I was opposed to this abomination. Vote for me. But Ben Franklin, to his credit, challenged some of these people who eventually didn't sign and say, I got some reservations and I don't agree with everything in there, but it's for the good of the nation.
Yeah, and Franklin's a great example, because this is a guy who, he's in his later years at this point in time.
He is,
and was always a pretty practical guy in terms of politics himself. He was not, my understanding is that he wasn't so ideological, that he was always wedded to, he had his own thoughts about what the best way of doing things was, but he had been around long enough and had been, overseas and serving in so many capacities that he understood that ultimately what was most important was to get what needed to get done.
Yes.
And the form maybe not as important. Now some of these young, you have Madison, who is relatively young. He's
Hmm.
earnest. He is incredibly sincere in his thinking about what the best form of government is and would be.
Hmm.
But you've got people with different perspectives. There are different stages in their life. They have different personal ambitions as well.
Hmm.
And again, this was not a perfect. They knew this wasn't a perfect document because they knew they were incapable of creating such a thing
Right.
as human beings. And they included Article 5 in in the 7 articles because they knew this was likely going to need to be amended in the future, and they saw the problems that the articles had with that its own amendment process. So um they just needed something that was going to do the trick, get them to the next phase.
Right. That's a wonderful point, because that's what it was. Many of them saw the inherent flaws in some of the documents. To this day, people will say there's flaws in the document,
Of course.
but the thing is, as you said, these men were not infallible. They weren't gods. They came up with a document that was probably the leading cutting edge document for the time. It's a document that has served as a basis for other nations' constitutions. When you had revolutions breaking out in South America in the 1780s and beyond, they started adopting modeling the U.S. Constitution. Ironically, the Soviet Union's Constitution
Yeah.
was based upon the United States Constitution. I think it
Yeah.
was for show, but it goes to show that they realized, and I think the Article 5 for amendment was brilliant on their
Mm.
part, because it also became a selling point.
Hmm.
Because these people had, now that they created this document, was okay, now what do we do? Now they got to go back and sell this product to all the states.
Yeah.
And there were a few other things I could get into, in a bit, about what they did to try and encourage this adoption by the various states.
Well, that's what
But
I
they,
want to get into that next.
yeah,
um
and so they did, but it reflects upon, when you get, first of all, I think it was brilliant by Pennsylvania to send Franklin,
yeah.
because if you look, even Washington didn't have the political capital, or Hamilton didn't have the political capital that
Yeah.
Franklin had. And so you had this statesman who was there, who was able to provide guidance to the entire. And I think people forget that he was a driving force for two documents,
Oh yeah.
the Independence and the Constitution.
Yeah.
So it did give some credibility. But yes, it wasn't a perfect document, but it was for the time and for now. I still believe it's the cutting edge document
Yeah, I
ever
don't think
created.
there's a better one out
No,
there.
no, there
So
isn't.
so they so the Constitution is completed.
Hmm.
They come up with a scheme in Article 7 by which 9 of the 13 states need to approve it, need to
Yep.
ratify it for it to take effect. Now, again, they're leaving the Constitutional Convention, or what we now call the Constitutional Convention, and they weren't given the power to do
Right.
what they were doing.
Right.
How did any of them think that they were just going to be ignored, that the Confederation Congress or the states would say, I don't really care what you just spent 3 months working on. You don't have the authority to do that. We have a constitution and we have a
Yeah.
way to amend that if needed. I mean, how bold was it for them to think that they could do this?
It was very bold. That's the best way I can describe it. It was very, very bold. I mean, it wasn't as treasonous as the Declaration of Independence, but it was, pardon my French, it was ballsy
Yeah.
to do it. I mean, just to completely go against what was the instructions of their legislatures, and what the what the Confederation Congress was expecting to come out with this document, was both earth-shattering and very, very bold. Um, at the time, politically, you have to keep in mind, Massachusetts is considered, because they always have been, but it was considered a very radical state.
Mm.
Pennsylvania was considered a radical state at the time. Um, Rhode Island was considered conservative. New York was considered conservative. What helped, when they didn't realize, we now have to convince the legislatures to adopt this. So they're basically advocating for a complete government restructure, um, without going through the full process of, they're basically bypassing the Articles of Confederation. So when you had, what helped, they realized, now they got to start the publicity campaign. They have to start justifying why they
Yeah.
can do this. And one of the arguments was strong centralized government and the needs for a strong centralized government. The second was the protection of individual rights as well as states' rights. And then finally, it was third, in order for us to survive as a nation in this current world environment, we need this document.
Yeah.
That was the big three. The states in the South were able to go back and say we were able to get these compromises, for purposes of our slavery. The smaller states were able to go back and say we've got these protections. And then there was my favorite part of everything that they did, which is kind of buried in the Constitution. They also made a proposal. They said, listen, we have this massive debt, particularly the debt that the Continental Congress raised. It was millions of dollars. And what Continental did, go back, Continental Congress would print up money. And basically, so Andy Goldstein enlists in the 3rd Massachusetts Regiment, and you were paid in Continental dollars, which was basically an IOU.
Yeah.
And the IOU says that once we get money or when the war ends or both, we'll pay you. You just present that slip. And of course, through inflation, the value just depreciated significantly to the point at the end of the war, they were worthless. But many people had them and were still holding out hope. And of course, the states were burdened because the states basically guaranteed these payments through the Continental Congress. So one of the things that the Constitutional Convention actually adopted and was promoted to encourage the states to ratify this document was, hey, the federal government will adopt that debt, and we will pay off pennies on the dollar on those Continental bills. So state of Massachusetts, we know you issued Continental dollars to your troops and you said you would guarantee it. We're going to assume that guarantee and we're going to pay it off. And of course, my favorite story, which I don't know if I've ever told, was a gentleman out of Newburyport called Timothy Dexter. Timothy Dexter was the wealthiest person in Newburyport in the early 1800s, but in 1787, he's broke. He never fought in the American Revolution, but he engaged in currency speculation, where he would go around to ex-continental soldiers and buy up their continental dollars. So in 1790, I believe it was, a federal official arrives in Newburyport, to start buying the continental dollars because the Constitution was adopted, and now the federal government has to buy off these continental dollars. Andy Goldstein shows up with 1 or 2 continental dollars, gets his pennies. Alex Cain shows up, maybe I have 5, I got 5 cents worth. Timothy Dexter showed up with 4 truckloads.
Oh my God! Yeah.
He became a multimillionaire overnight. So it's always I like telling that story,
That's awesome.
And amazingly, he was a very strong supporter of the Constitution. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I don't know why. So now that provision, I assume that was probably a Hamilton push provision.
It was a Hamilton push provision.
So now, in terms of ratification, one other thing that was, to go back on your mention of ballsy, when they came up with the means of ratification, they did not send this back to the state legislatures to ratify this new constitution. They instructed the states essentially to create these ratifying conventions so that the people who would be populating these conventions as newly elected representatives in this constitutional convention, around the country in the various states would be the ones who would be voting. And that was, they were creating this new form of self-government where the people, to some extent, would be controlling their own fate, ruling themselves. And what better way to do that than to have the people deciding whether or not, as opposed to the states, whether we should go down this road of this new form of government too. So that was pretty brilliant as well.
That was very brilliant. Here's the ironic part, if you want to say irony. Many of the delegates did not trust the common man. Okay, they felt that those who should hold office and those who should vote should be landowners and the wealthy, because they either felt they were uneducated or they were just a mob that would be easily controlled by demagogues, and a whole various other issues. And that was a hot debate during the Constitutional Convention. How much power do we give the common dude? Is it much? But here they are. They're going back to the common man, and they're basically trying to rally the common man. So you could argue they were doing everything that they were rallying against during the convention, but it was brilliant because it gave the people a sense of participation, and it gave the people a sense to belong in it.
Yeah, and ultimately the government they created at that point in time, the only thing the people were allowed to vote for were their representatives in the House of Representatives, because at that point in time they weren't voting for their senators. Those senators would be selected by the
Right.
state legislatures. President, even as is true today, there was an electoral college, slightly different system at that point. But
Hmm.
they granted the people limited control,
Yes.
but by giving the people the right to choose those in the House, they gave the people control over this new federal government's raising taxes
Hmm.
and um, going forward with an impeachment proceeding or
Right.
whatnot. So it was interesting. They you know the whole government is constantly, it's just another check where the people are given the ability to check the state legislatures to some degree
Hmm.
by ratifying the Constitution, but at the same time, they have very limited power. They have an important check
Hmm.
in the new government, but it's their role is still pretty limited.
Right. And it's interesting too, because it also, and you just jogged my memory on this, from the local politician's perspective, this entire constitutional convention was also an opportunity for local politicians as well to sort of rally their local
Yeah,
machines. So if you had somebody like in our area, the Saltonstall family, the Saltonstall family was a very politically powerful family in the Haverhill up into the Amesbury areas, or the Merrill families, where they were heavily involved in the Massachusetts legislature. Now they have an opportunity to, go to New York and be part of this Congress. Of course, they're going
yeah,
to try and rally their political base, and then, of course, there's people who want to get involved in this constitutional convention who might be able to use it as a springboard to replace, a
sure.
Saltonstall. So it did, even though it was limited, the people did have sort of a sense that like participation in it. But yes, when it came to senators, you're absolutely right. It was the legislature that
Yeah.
was sending them off.
So let me pause for a second. We're at about hour and 20.
Hmm.
It may make sense if you are willing to do this one more time in the
Of
future
course I
to
am.
stop here, and then we'll go through the ratification process
I'd love
in
to.
our next meeting.
Absolutely. As many times as you want me, Andy, I'd love to come back.
Well, thank you, Alex. This is wonderful, even better than the first time, and the first time was great. And but I think this is a good chunk of
Right.
information for my students to absorb.
Perfect.
But that's awesome. So I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna let you go, and then
Okay.
I'm actually going to put those links up and talk a little bit about your books and your
Okay.
business. And thank you so much, Alex. I
Hey,
really appreciate the
no,
time.
no problem. Best to the family and to your students. Give them all A's.
I don't know about that. Thank you. I'll
All
try.
right. All right. I'll be talking to you, Eddie. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
See you
Bye-bye.
later.
Bye.
Okay. So that was great. I really want to thank my friend Alex for giving us so much of his time and so much of his wisdom and knowledge on this subject. So let me now pull up. I'm going to screen share, and I want to show you the books that I talked about before. So let me sort of get this out of here. All right. So let me start first with Alex's own website. If you want to check this out, this is called Historical Nerdery, and it goes through a little bit about the website and Alex, and talks about some of the services that he's able to provide, his consultation services, coming to speak and whatnot. So I definitely would suggest that you check out that website. And one of his business website, if not the business website, is called Untapped History. This is a historic tour, walking tour of the city of Newburyport in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, with COVID, I'm not sure. I assume things are probably not happening in terms of the in-person tours, but I do know that there are some distance learning resources and services that are available. So this is a great site to check out. You can see Alex's partner as well, Eric, and talks a little bit about booking a tour. He has a little shop here too, so you can check out. I'm going to show you these on Amazon in a second, but I'll tell you, it's a lot less money if you want to buy these books directly from Alex at Untapped History. This is one of his books. It's called I See Nothing But the Horrors of a Civil War for $2. And we stood our ground. This was Alex's first book. That's only $1, and mugs and things of that sort. So let's go over to Amazon. You can see Amazon is selling the paperback of Alex's book for about 18 bucks. So if you want to, read about it and see what it's all about, you can definitely check it out on Amazon. This is a second book. I See Nothing But the Horrors of a Civil War. And I would definitely suggest that you check out all those sites. I really, again, want to thank Alex for giving us his time and, you know, his knowledge, and look forward to that final meeting where we're going to talk about the ratification debates that are what was necessary to make this proposed constitution our actual constitution that we live under still today. So thank you all very much, and I'll talk to you soon.